The solstice and equinoxes are some of my favorite days of the year, but probably not for the reason you expect. One thing I want to be careful about when I talk about living seasonally is that I don't think that that requires abandoning modern life, right? Sometimes these conversations can feel a little disconnected from reality. People hear someone talk about seasonal living and immediately picture moving off grid, growing all their own food, getting rid of their phone and disappearing into the woods somewhere. That wasn't my experience at all. The practices that changed my life actually began while I was deeply embedded in modern society. Years ago, I was running a large scale wedding and event operation in Southern California. I was managing employees, sitting in traffic, answering emails, just living a very busy life. And from the outside, my life looked successful. But underneath that success was a nervous system that never really got a seasoned rest. If I felt exhausted, I just pushed through. If I felt uninspired, I just pushed through. If I felt like I needed rest, I often interpreted that as something being wrong with me rather than information worth listening to. Then around 2019, something shifted in my life. I had this really intense experience that completely collapsed how I viewed everything about my life. It sent me down a path of asking bigger questions about how I was living and whether the pace I had normalized was actually healthy. One of the things that emerged from that period was a fascination with the natural world and the rhythms that exist all around us. I started paying attention to what was happening outside my own agenda. For example, I started noticing that the trees weren't doing the same thing in January that they were doing in June, right? I noticed that the animals changed their behavior depending on the season. I noticed that daylight itself was constantly changing, right? Some days were longer and others were shorter. The entire natural world was moving through cycles, yet I was expecting myself to operate the same every day, all year long, all the time. And looking back, it seems obvious, right? Hindsight's 2020. I was trying to override something that every other living thing seemed to understand intuitively. One of the practices that emerged from that realization was me beginning to celebrate the solstice and equinoxes. I started hosting these gatherings at my home in Southern California. These were super special. What I loved most about these gatherings wasn't any particular activity we did, it was the act of intentionally pausing long enough to acknowledge that a season had changed. In modern life, it's easy to move from one day to the next without noticing much of anything. We look at our calendars, but we rarely stop to consider where we are in the larger cycle of the year or what the natural world around us is doing. Those gatherings gave us an opportunity to do exactly that. There's something powerful about a group of people, especially women, who gather with that kind of intention. Not because anyone has the answers, but because we are taking a moment to remember that we are participants in these cycles, not observers standing outside of them. So, for a few hours during these events, we would step out of that productivity, deadline, and obligations and reorient ourselves to something much older. The changing of the seasons became a reminder that life moves in cycles, that growth and rest both have their place, and that perhaps we aren't meant to live the same way every day of the year. These events I held were meant to acknowledge that something had changed. The summer solstice marks the longest day of the year, and in many traditions, it represents abundance, vitality, growth. To me personally, it represents the fullness of life. The sun has reached its peak before the gradual return towards, the shorter days start to begin again. What I find interesting is that our ancestors understood these transitions kind of deeply because they lived in direct relationship with the land. The changing seasons weren't some abstract concept. They influence food and work, energy, survival, community. For me, living seasonally started with Small observations, noticing when the sun rose and set, spending a little more time outside, paying attention to my energy levels throughout the year. Asking myself whether the expectations I had actually matched the season I was in. I basically started copying what the natural world was doing, and my life drastically improved, even while living a busy Southern California life. When I was younger, I never paid attention to things like the solstice or equinoxes. I couldn't have told you when they happen. And if I did know, I certainly didn't think they had anything to do with my life personally. I was living the way most of us do. My schedule was determined by work, obligations, deadlines, appointments, and well, I don't know, whatever happened to be on my calendar. I woke up at the same time year round. I went to bed roughly at the same time year round. I expected the same level of productivity for myself in January that I expected in July. For me, living seasonally doesn't mean following rigid rules or pretending like I'm living in the 1600s, right? It simply means I'm paying attention. In the winter, I naturally need more rest, more reflection, and more quieter evenings, a slower life in general. In the summer, I tend to feel more creative, more social, more energized. I stay up later because the sun stays up later. I spend more time outside. The weather's really great. I naturally feel drawn toward growth and projects and adventures. Instead of fighting those rhythms, I learned to work with them, even as a modern person in a modern day society. And the result has been a life that feels significantly less forced. That's one of the reasons I wanted to relaunch this channel on the summer solstice. The season has always represented growth and vitality to me. It feels like it's in a like an appropriate moment to bring something into the light that has been quietly growing behind the scenes. We're earthlings. We were born of this planet and shaped by the same forces that shape the forest, the rivers, the mountains, and the seasons around us. The minerals in our bones were once part of the earth itself. The rhythms of sunlight influence our hormones, our energy, our sleep, and our moods, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. For me, the solstice and equinoxes became an opportunity to remember that, to step outside the illusion that I'm somehow standing outside of nature, observing it, instead of recognizing that I'm a part of it. Let me know if you live in conjunctions with the season, and have a good week.